Ever look up and wonder, like, how do drones actually stay up there? It's kind of like magic,
It
right?
does feel that way sometimes.
Yeah. Especially after flipping through this FAA study guide you sent over.
Yeah, it's pretty intense.
When it gets into the aerodynamic stuff, whoa. But no worries, today we're going to break it all down. Forces of flight, especially how they work for us drone pilots.
Absolutely. And what makes this deep dive so cool is that the study guide is clearly for someone prepping for, like, the FAA Part 107 exam.
Right.
So it's not just theory. We're talking real-world drone stuff.
Love it. Okay, so the guide starts with its 4 forces of flight: lift, weight, thrust, and drag.
The basics.
Yeah, at first glance, it's a lot of jargon,
Mm-hmm.
but it gets really interesting.
It does once you dig in. Like, most people think of lift, they think wings.
Right.
But for drone pilots, it's all about how lift works with those rotors, you know?
Yeah, it's like each of those spinning propellers is its own mini wing, pushing air down to create that upward force.
Totally. And that right there, that's Newton's third law in action. Every action, equal and opposite reaction. Propellers push down on the air pushes back up with lift, keeps your drone up.
Okay, makes sense. But then the guide also mentions Bernoulli's principle. Where does that fit in?
Ah, good question. So Bernoulli's principle, it's all about how the speed of air affects this pressure, basically. Faster moving air has lower pressure.
Okay.
So the shape of a wing, or in our case, that spinning propeller, it's designed so the air on top moves faster than the air underneath, creates that pressure difference.
So it's the lower pressure on top that's also helping create the lift.
You got it. And here's where it gets cool for drone pilots. The faster the propellers spin, the more lift. More lift, higher your drone can go. But you can also get more lift by changing the angle of attack.
Wait, angle of attack, is that just like tilting the whole drone up?
Kind of. Imagine you're holding your hand out a car window, right?
Yeah.
And you tilt it up slightly in that wind.
Okay.
Feel that force pushing your hand up. That's kind of what we're doing with a drone's angle of attack. Tilting it slightly increases the angle that air hits the propellers, forcing more air down. Boom, more lift.
More speed, higher angle equals more lift. But I'm guessing there's a limit to all this.
Oh, for sure.
You can't just tilt it forever or those things will spin off.
Exactly. And that's where our next force comes in. Good old weight.
Right. Back to reality.
It might seem basic,
Mm-hmm.
but understanding weight and how it works with lift, that's huge for pilots.
Yeah, well, weight's just gravity doing its thing, right? Pulling everything down.
Right, and every drone has a max weight it can handle before it simply can't create enough lift to overcome that.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So like overloading my drone with gear, it'd be like stuffing my backpack too full.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, it's just too heavy to carry.
Exactly, and that's why this study guide gets into center of gravity.
CG.
Exactly.
Which, by the way, they have that cool example with the string. You can try this at home, folks.
Absolutely, yeah. It's about balance. Imagine you attach a string to a point on your drone. If it balances perfectly, that's your CG, your drone's balancing point.
Like on a seesaw.
Exactly. And any changes you make, adding a camera, extra battery, it shifts that CG.
So you got to be really careful where you're putting things on your aircraft. It's not just the weight, it's how that weight is distributed.
You got it. Even small changes can drastically change how the drone handles. Could be the difference between a smooth flight and, well...
Disaster. So we've got lift, battling it out with weight. But how does a drone actually move through the air? That's got to be thrust, right?
You got it. Thrust is like the engine in a car, but for drones, it propels the drone forward, or in any direction, really, if you're flying multi-rotor.
Oh, right.
And just like with lift, it all comes back to those awesome little airfoils, the propellers.
Wait, so those propellers are doing double duty, creating lift and thrust.
They are. It all depends on how they're angled and which way they're spinning. You can adjust them to generate mainly lift to keep you airborne or thrust to move you through the air.
That is so cool. So you're telling me, like, just by adjusting the angle of those little propellers, I can make my drone fly sideways. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing what those things can do. The study guide actually does a really good job of comparing fixed wing drones. You know, they use their wings for lift, propellers for thrust to rotorcraft, where those propellers got to do both.
It's mind-blowing. But of course, it can't all be smooth sailing.
Sadly not.
There's got to be something working against all that awesome thrust we're creating.
There is, yeah. Drag. It's the force that's constantly trying to slow you down.
Drag. Yeah, okay. Like that resistance you feel when you try to run through water, right?
Exactly. And it's a huge thing for drone pilots to be aware of, especially when you're trying to get the most out of your battery life.
Okay, now you're speaking my language. Because more flight time equals more fun.
Right. Nobody wants their flight to end early.
Absolutely not. So how does drag actually work?
Well, they break it down in the guide into two main types: parasite drag and induced drag.
Okay. Two kinds of drag, got it.
Yeah, so parasite drag, think about sticking your hand out the window of a moving car.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
The faster you go, the more resistance you feel, right?
totally.
That's parasite drag. Basically, it's the friction of your drone moving through the air.
Okay, that makes sense. So a super sleek aerodynamic drone would have less parasite drag.
Exactly. The guide actually compares it to a Ferrari versus a PT Cruiser.
I love that. That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah, the more aerodynamic your drone, the less parasite drag it'll have, and the more efficiently it'll move through the air.
So less drag, longer flights, more battery.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Mhm.
What about that other kind of drag? Induced drag. Sounds kind of mysterious.
It does a bit, and it can be a little counterintuitive. Induced drag is actually a byproduct of lift.
Really?
Yeah. Remember how we talked about the angle of attack and how it affects lift?
Yeah, yeah. Tilt that drone up, more lift.
Right. Well, that same angle of attack that gives you that lift also creates drag.
So it's like a trade-off. The more lift you have, the more drag you create.
It is, yeah. And understanding that trade-off is really key for drone pilots, especially because, and this is the counterintuitive part-induced drag actually increases as your speed decreases.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying going slower creates more drag. What's going on there?
It's all about maintaining lift. At slower speeds, to maintain lift, you need a higher angle of attack.
Okay, follow.
But that higher angle of attack, it creates these little swirls of air, these vortices at the edges of the propellers. And those vortices, they create drag.
So it's like pushing a shopping cart easier to push fast, right?
Exactly. And knowing how to find that balance between lift, thrust, and drag, it's essential for flying efficiently and safely.
Man, this is blowing my mind. It's like my drone is constantly in this epic battle with physics, with linked against weight and thrust against drag.
It really is.
And we haven't even talked about wind and weather and stuff yet.
Yeah.
But before we move on, we got to talk about stalls.
Oh, yes, stalls, big one.
People will talk about stalling the engine in a car. But this is a different kind of stall, right?
Totally different.
What's the deal with stalls in the drone world?
So a drone stall, it's what happens when the airflow over those propellers gets disrupted. You lose lift suddenly.
You're going down.
Yeah, and it's not just about going too slow, which a lot of people think.
Right, right.
It's all about that angle of attack again.
So exceeding that critical angle of attack, that's what causes the stall.
Exactly. It's like you're tilting your hand up in that stream of water again and you go too far.
Yeah.
It disrupts the flow, creates all that turbulence. Same thing with a drone. You tilt it too far, the airflow over those propellers gets messed up, they lose lift.
And suddenly you're not flying anymore.
Exactly. Not flying the way you want to be, at least.
Definitely not.
Uh,
So, okay, stall happens. What's a pilot to do?
well, recovering from a stall, that's just as important as knowing what causes it.
Right.
And usually it's all about decreasing that angle of attack. Get those propellers back to where they can grab that air again.
Easier said than done, I bet, when you're panicking.
That's true. Takes practice. Simulators are great for that, by the way.
Oh, yeah, good point.
Learn how to handle those stalls without the risk of actually crashing.
Love it. Okay, so stalls, angle of attack, got to keep those in mind. But there was something else. Load factor. The guide mentioned that. What is load factor? Sounds kind of intimidating.
That does sound intense, yeah.
Yeah.
But think of it like being on a roller coaster.
Okay.
You know that feeling when you go down a steep drop, that force pushing you down in your seat?
Yeah.
That's basically load factor. It's gravity plus the force from accelerating.
So the more intense the maneuver, the higher the load factor.
Exactly. Sharp turns, sudden drops, that all increases the load factor on your drone.
Makes sense. And I'm guessing this is important for drone pilots to know about.
Oh, for sure. Because a higher load factor, it means your drone needs to work harder to maintain lift.
Which brings us back to that angle of attack.
Yep. And the closer you are to that critical angle,
The easier it is to stall. Yikes. Okay, so I got to think about this even more when I'm making turns or flying fast.
it's all connected, you know? And that's what I think is so cool about this study guide. It highlights how these things work together. Like knowing that making a sharp turn close to the ground, that's extra risky because you've got less time to recover if you stall.
Makes sense. Okay, so much to think about. But wait, there's more. we're not done yet with the physics lessons, are we?
Never done with physics.
The guide talks about center of gravity, and even the weather can mess with drone performance.
Absolutely. Like we were saying before, that center of gravity, that's your drone's balancing point.
Hmm.
Even small changes in weight distribution, like where your camera's pointed, it all affects how your drone flies.
Like that seesaw example, right?
Yeah.
Move a little bit, the whole balance changes.
Exactly. It's all about physics. And then, yeah, you've got external factors like altitude, temperature, humidity.
Right, because that affects air density, right?
Yeah.
Which also changes how the drone performs.
Exactly. Air density, basically how tightly packed those air molecules are, it affects how much grip those propellers have. Higher altitude, thinner air, less grip. Hot day, same thing.
Makes sense. So it's like trying to swim in a pool versus the ocean. Way harder to move in the ocean.
Exactly. Your drone's got to work harder at higher altitudes on hot days to generate the same amount of lift. And that means...
That means less battery life.
Exactly. Drains your battery faster.
Okay, this is all making so much sense now.
Yeah.
But it's not just a weather report. It's like essential information for flying a drone.
It all matters.
Yeah.
And that's not even everything. The study guide talks about runway length, wind conditions, obstacles.
So many factors. This is amazing.
Being aware of your surroundings, planning your flights carefully, it's all part of being a good pilot.
It really is. Okay, I have learned so much today. We went from basic physics to, like, advanced drone maneuvering.
It's amazing how much goes into it, right?
It is. But here's what I'm taking away from all of this. Understanding this stuff, it's not just about passing a test. It's about being a better, safer pilot.
Couldn't agree more. This study guide, it really highlights how seemingly small details can make a huge difference when it comes to drones.
Totally. It's all about respecting those forces at play, like you said. Because at the end of the day, it's not magic keeping those drones up there.
It's physics.
Exactly. Now, one thing we didn't get into today is how different drone models are designed. Some are more stable than others, you know.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
That's a whole other deep dive waiting to happen. But for now, we're going to leave you with this thought. Next time you see a drone just cruising through the air, remember, it's not magic, it's physics. And the more you understand those forces, the better a pilot you'll be. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, happy flying.